The tar stank so bad the parliamentarians could taste the sea on their tongues, as a tattered captain shoved a dripping ear across the table and said, "Behold." You think wars start with grand strategy papers and sober statesmen. Actually, sometimes they start with someone losing a body part and somebody else flaring their outrage. In 1738-39, the British turned the clipped ear of Robert Jenkins, literally presented to Parliament in a jar, into a morality play about Spanish treachery and maritime law. The ear was a vivid, gruesome prop that helped turn long-standing grievances about smuggling, trade restrictions, and imperial rivalry into a call for war. Behind the theater, Britain wanted to protect its merchant fleets and punish Spain's interference in Atlantic commerce. Jenkins' ear was the perfect scandalous excuse. Parliament smelled blood and empire, and the War of Jenkins' ear marched out of a tavern tale and into cannon smoke. Number 1, the Pig War, 1859, a standoff on San Juan Island between American settlers and British subjects that could have been solved by better fencing. Imagine a sunburned farmer shooting a trespassing hog that started rooting in his potato patch, then being hauled off by a British constable, and suddenly imperial dignity is offended. You think national borders are drawn by treaties and generals. Sometimes they get redrawn because someone loved their spuds more than international diplomacy. The real issue was the vague Oregon Treaty Line and competing claims to the islands, strategic waterways, not pork. The pig's death became a perfect low-temperature spark. Insults, militia movements, and naval guns arrived, but cooler heads and a mutual sense of the absurd kept outright war at bay. It took arbitration and decades to sort the border, but the pig got all the headlines. Number 2, the War of the Oaken Bucket, 1325, where Italy's pettiest theft turned into regional bloodshed. Picture Modeni's knights sneaking into Bologna at night, ripping a huge wooden bucket from a communal well like teenagers swiping a rival school's mascot. You'd think medieval city-states gnawed at each other for dynasties and doctrine, but sometimes civic honor hinged on agricultural hardware. The bucket was a public symbol. Stealing it was an insult to the city's masculinity and prestige. And Modena and Bologna had been trading slaps for years over territory and influence. The theft let both sides dress old rivalries in righteous outrage and mobilize supporters who already hated each other's trade monopolies and alliances. So a water pail became the rosette on a bloody cake of regional politics. Number 3, the 1969 football war between El Salvador and Honduras, where football matches became the matchstick. You think national wars are birthed by diplomats and doctrine. Here a furnace of social tension blew up after heated World Cup qualifiers spilled into riots and murder. The matches were the visible spark over a tinderbox of land reform, migrant labor, and poverty. Honduran land laws were expelling Salvadoran peasants, and Salvadorans were angry and desperate. The soccer frenzy gave leaders a visceral symbol to rally around and an excuse to flex military muscle. The games were less cause than catalyst. In days, diplomatic rupture ballooned into airstrikes, tanks, and hundreds dead. A brutal reminder that sporting rage can be weaponized when borders, livelihoods, and xenophobia are already. Number 4, the Pastry War, 1838-39, where a Frenchman's fondness for compensation led to cannon fire in Veracruz. A French pastry chef in Mexico City claimed looters had ransacked his shop years earlier and demanded indemnity. French diplomats treated this like a test of national honor. You might laugh, picturing a flaky tart triggering a naval blockade, but the incident was the public face of simmering complaints about unpaid damages and French protection of nationals. More broadly, France wanted influence in Mexico and a gilded excuse to assert power. The pastry-made grievance was tailor-made for gunboat diplomacy. So a small claims dispute turned into a bombardment and treaty, and somewhere a baker probably rethought his business insurance. Number 5, the so-called War of the Stray Dog, 1925, a conflict that began with one man's sprint after a mud. A Greek soldier chased his escapee across the frontier into Bulgaria, shots were fired, and one Greek was killed, immediately inflaming nationalist passions. You expect armies to fight over maps and treaties. Here a dog strolls into geopolitics. The real bones of the conflict were Macedonia's unsettled borders, minority tensions, and both countries' desire to show they wouldn't tolerate incursions. Bulgaria appealed to the League of Nations, Greece fumed, and mobilization met mediation. The stray canine acted like a fuse on a pile of dry wood. It shows how fragile post-war borders can be when human and canine mistakes are framed as deliberate affronts. Number 6, the Anglo-Zanzibar War of 1896, possibly the shortest war ever fired and finished in under an hour. The death of a pro-British sultan led the British to demand his successor be their puppet. When the new man refused to step down, Britain issued an ultimatum and then shelled the palace. You expect imperial interventions to involve months of diplomacy. Here a succession spat turned into naval salvos and the swift imposition of a compliant ruler. The underlying issue was imperial control of a strategic African trading hub and the British appetite for dominance. The world watched as modern cruiser guns and a miscalculated sultan turned palace politics into a brief fireworks display with real casualties and a clear imperial method. Number 7. The Emu War of 1932, where the Australian army tried to exterminate emus with machine guns and failed spectacularly. Farmers, desperate after crops were trampled and eaten, asked for military help. Soldiers arrived with Lewis guns and confidence, then learned birds are fast, directional, and bad at cueing. You'd expect state military power to solve agricultural pests. Instead, the emus outmaneuvered human tactics, scattering in ways that jammed guns and frustrated men. Beneath the comedy lay genuine hardship, post-war veterans on marginal lands, poor harvests, and an administration under pressure to protect livelihoods. The Emu War became a cautionary tale in hubris. Modern weapons don't always translate to pest control, and national embarrassment can be measured in feathers. Number 8. The Chicken War of 1537. A Polish noble rebellion that earned its name from how little actual fighting happened and how much looting of farmyard fowl did. Nobles rose against King Sigismund I over royal policies and a fear of centralized power. They marched more in gesture than with plan, and the affair ended without a major pitched battle. The nickname comes from mocking the movement's lack of seriousness. Peasants and soldiers mostly ended up stealing chickens. The conflict highlights how internal politics, noble privilege, and fear of reform can produce theatrical rather than decisive clashes. It was less a war of attrition and more a posturing caucus, showing that elites sometimes prefer symbol and spectacle to strategic clarity. Number 9. The Toledo War, 1835-36. An interstate spat between Ohio and the newly formed Michigan Territory over a narrow strip of land. The legal tangle began with ambiguous colonial-era surveys and a little thing called pride. Both capitals wanted the port of Toledo for trade and bragging rights. A warrant, an arrest, and a couple of militia confrontations later, the two sides were pointing muskets at each other while Washington tried not to laugh. Underneath the farce were real economic stakes, access to Lake Erie and the shipping routes that came with it. The feds brooked no large battle and eventually brokered a compromise. But not before statehood and a lot of bluster turned a mapping error into an almost. Number 10. The War of the Golden Stool, 1900. A clash between the Ashanti people and British colonials sparked by a cultural insult that the British could not understand. The Golden Stool was the spiritual throne of the Ashanti nation. Sitting on it was sacrilegious, and when a British official demanded to sit on it, the act touched off fierce resistance. You might think empires fight for resources or borders alone, yet here a demand for symbolic dominance triggered revolt. Britain wanted administrative control and to showcase imperial authority. The Ashanti fought to preserve identity and sacred law. The conflict was brutal and asymmetrical, and it proved how imperial ignorance of local symbols can turn petty demands into full-scale rebellion. Number 11. The Aroostook War, 1838-39. A lumberjack standoff between the United States and British North America over where Maine ended and Canada began. Trees, timber rights, and the money tangled up in them were the real prizes. But the flashpoints were roadside arrests and arrested loggers, small incidents that snowballed. The nickname Pork and Beans War poked fun at how domestic the conflict seemed. Federal troops, militia, and a lot of rhetoric over who could fell which pines. Under the jokes were strategic concerns about territory, trade routes, and national prestige. Eventually diplomacy, reinforcements, and men in overcoats calmed the sawdust-flying tempers, but not before the maps and the egos had done their noisy dance. Number 12. The Cod Wars, a series of confrontations from the 1950s to 1970s between Iceland and the United Kingdom that began over how far a nation's fishing claims could extend. Iceland unilaterally extended its territorial waters to protect stocks, and British trawlers, whose livelihoods depended on the rich cod banks, kept pushing back. You might think territorial expansion would wait for formal treaty rooms, but fishermen, nets, and national pride turned messy fast. Collisions, net cutting, and even ramming replaced polite diplomacy as coast guards tried to police the cold sea. Beneath the squall were real economic survival questions. For Iceland, wearing out its fish was existential. For Britain, it was about industry and tradition. In the end, international law caught up with ecology, and a lot of boats bore the... Number 13. The War of the Oranges, 1801. A brief Spanish assault on Portugal that acquired its nickname from a cheeky anecdote about a general tossing oranges to a queen. Spain, prodded by Napoleonic France, demanded Portugal close its ports to Britain. When Portugal refused, Spain invaded, and General God allegedly picked oranges at Elvas and sent them to Madrid as a trophy. The citrus showpiece made a short, weirdly titled war that masked deeper Franco-Spanish strategic goals about power balance on the peninsula. This episode shows how theatrical symbolism can dress up coercion. What looks like a flirtatious fruit gift was actually a lever for influence and alliance politics. So an orange became a PR prop for geopolitical muscle. Number 14. The Oyster Wars, a patchwork of violent clashes in the late 19th and early 20th centuries over who could harvest Chesapeake oysters. These weren't single declared wars so much as recurring low-grade conflicts. Armed oyster pirate skiffs, legal cutters, and even National Guard deployments fought over the lucrative beds. You think wars need grand causes. Sometimes they're about who gets to shuck and sell a bivalve. Under the surface were broken licensing systems, collapsing stocks, and economic desperation that turned watermen into combatants. The result was smuggling, shootouts, and a messy tug-of-war between state authority and local survival, proof that maritime livelihoods can ignite the deadliest of local grudges. That was 15 wars and near wars that began with small, absurd catalysts. An ear, a pig, a stolen bucket, a pastry claim, a soccer riot, and more, each one a grim reminder that human conflict often wears theatrical masks. The pattern is the same. An evocative incident becomes the public face of long-simmering tensions. Economic strain, disputed borders, cultural disrespect, and imperial ambition, and leaders use outrage like kindling. The petty story is easier to sell to a populace than complex geopolitics. So a spectacle replaces tedious argument, and suddenly mobilization seems patriotic rather than punitive. If you ever imagine statesmanship as sober and rational, remember these cases. Rage, theater, and a little luck in timing can decide whether a skirmish becomes a war. History's lesson is that small humiliations can be magnified into massive violence when they meet fear and opportunity. If this ruined your faith in grown-ups, you know what to do next.